2.5 million tons. 100 days, the impossible challenge of D-Day engineering. One man was told it couldn't be done. The odds were mathematically impossible. A 10-to-1 technical disadvantage at the shore. Military analysts said the invasion would fail here. But on June 6, 1944, everything changed. A critical situation required a port out of thin air. Every expert in the room predicted a catastrophe. What happened next rewrote the laws of physics. The hero didn't just survive. He built a city on water. The secret method. It is still classified in parts today. He reached his goal by the end of the month. The tactic is still taught at West Point today. The moment he figured it out is absolutely brilliant. Our story begins in a dark London basement. The year is 1942, and the Allies are desperate. The impossible challenge was just beginning to take shape. Imagine the most violent water in Europe. The English Channel is a graveyard for traditional docks. The engineers had to fight the ocean and the enemy. Brigadier Bruce White looked at the flat beaches. He knew a standard port would be destroyed in days. He needed something that could breathe with the tide. Churchill sent a memo that changed history. Piers for use on flat beaches. Eat simply read. They must float up and down with the tide. The traditionalists laughed at this suggestion. You cannot anchor a city to shifting sand, they said. But Bruce White saw what they didn't. He designed the Phoenix caissons first. Massive hollow blocks the size of 5-story buildings. They would be the walls of an artificial harbor. Next came the whales, the floating roads. Steel spans, designed to flex like a human spine. They had to carry 40-ton tanks over 30-foot waves. Construction began in total secrecy across Britain. Thousands of workers had no idea what they were building. They were told it was special naval equipment. But here is what nobody knew at the time. The Germans were watching the major ports for clues. The engineers were building in the marshes instead. The deadline for Overlord was fast approaching. The designs weren't even finished by late 1943. The pressure was starting to crack the team. They tested the models in secret wave tanks. The first 3 designs crumbled under the pressure. White had to start over with only months left. He realized the anchors were the weak point. The force of the tide was too great for iron. He needed a kite anchor that dug deeper as it pulled. While engineers built, the soldiers trained. They had no idea their life support was a floating dock. The stakes had never been higher for a single project. The bombard and steel breakwaters were tested next. They were designed to kill the energy of the waves. If they failed, the inner harbor would be smashed. It was June 1944. The whales were ready. The phoenixes were lined up like concrete giants. The greatest engineering gamble in history was live. The fleet began to move across the dark water. Tugboats towed the massive concrete blocks at 4 knots. A single German torpedo would ruin the entire plan. The crossing was a logistical nightmare for the Navy. The weather was turning, and the sea was rising. They were dragging an entire harbor into a war zone. On the morning of D-Day, the first units arrived. The combat engineers landed while the sand was red. Their job was to clear the path for the floating city. But here is what nobody knew at the time. ... The currents at Omaha Beach were twice as fast as expected. The engineers had to adjust their math on the fly. The first Phoenix caisson began its slow descent. Valves were opened to let the seawater rush in. If it tilted just 1 degree, it would shatter on impact. The next 60 seconds would change everything. The block settled perfectly onto the seabed floor. The first wall of the harbor was finally in place. Under constant enemy fire, the work continued. The whales were connected piece by piece. A 3,000-foot roadway began to grow toward the shore. The German commanders watched in total disbelief. They hadn't defended the open beaches with heavy guns. They assumed no port meant no heavy reinforcements. But the whale was now handling its first load. A line of Sherman tanks rolled onto the floating steel. The impossible was becoming a physical reality. By day 3, the harbor was half operational. Thousands of tons of ammunition flowed inland. The engineers were winning the battle of supply. Then came the secret secondary mission, Operation Pluto. a pipeline under the ocean to carry vital fuel. The engineers were unrolling it like a giant spool of thread. The pipe had to withstand immense underwater pressure. It was a flexible steel ribbon, miles and miles long. Without this fuel, the tanks would stop in their tracks. Wait until you see what happens next. A massive storm began to brew in the North Atlantic. The worst summer gale in over 40 years was coming. The winds reached 60 miles per hour on the shore. The floating roadways began to whip like ribbons. The engineers watched as their life's work was tested. At Mulberry, at the American sector, the damage was fatal. The structures were pushed beyond their breaking point. The impossible obstacle had finally struck back. But at Mulberry B, the British sector, something was different. The engineers there had added a secret reinforcement. They used the kite anchors to hold the line. The storm raged for 3 days without stopping. The harbor at Omaha Beach was completely destroyed. All hope for a rapid inland push seemed to vanish. This is where it gets really interesting. The surviving harbor at Arromanches took the full load. It doubled its capacity overnight to save the invasion. The engineers worked through the night to repair the steel. They welded plates while the waves crashed over them. The Mulberry was the only thing keeping the war alive. By July, the harbor was the busiest port in the world. It was outperforming the Port of London by a mile. Over 500,000 vehicles had crossed the floating piers. The running count of supplies was staggering to see. 10,000 tons of food every single day. Enough fuel to keep 3 whole armies moving forward. Notice what happens next in the tactical records. The Germans tried to sabotage the piers with frogmen. The engineers countered with underwater light shows. Every night, the harbor was a target for the Luftwaffe. The smoke screens hidden on the piers saved the ships. The engineers were now soldiers in every sense. The impossible port lasted far longer than planned. It was designed for 90 days, but worked for 10 months. It became the heartbeat of the liberation of Europe. Let's look at the brilliant moment from minute 14. The engineer realized that the tide wasn't the enemy. He used the tide's own weight to lock the piers in place. By shifting the center of gravity as the water rose, the roads actually became more stable during high tide. It was a masterstroke of fluid dynamics and grit. When the port of Antwerp was finally captured, the Mulberry engineers finally took a breath of air. Their temporary city had won the war of logistics. The bobbins had finished the fuel lines as well. Millions of gallons of gas were pumped under the sea. The impossible had been defeated by a slide rule. What was the human cost of this engineering feat? Hundreds of divers lost their lives in the cold water. The sacrifice was as great as any infantry charge. After the war, the structures were left to the sea. You can still see the concrete ghosts at Arromanches. They stand as monuments to a madman's dream. The official recognition came in the years that followed. Bruce White was knighted for his service to the crown. His blueprints were archived as national treasures. The tactics were adopted by every modern military. Prefabricated logistics is now a standard doctrine. We use these lessons to respond to natural disasters today. Here's why this matters today. When you see a mobile hospital or a modular bridge, you're looking at the legacy of the Mulberry Harbor. It proved that no obstacle is truly impossible. It's just a problem that hasn't been solved by an engineer. The laws of physics are just tools in the right hands. Imagine you are standing on that floating pier in 1944. The ground is moving. The shells are falling nearby, but the tanks keep rolling because you did your job. The technical accuracy of the whale is still unmatched. No modern equivalent has been built on that scale. It remains the largest civil engineering project in war. The strategic context of the port cannot be overstated. Without it, the Battle of Normandy would have been lost. The Allies would have been pushed back into the sea. The impossible was a label given by those who feared. The engineers didn't have time for fear or doubt. They only had time for calculations and cold steel. The long-term impact on history is undeniable. It shortened the war by at least a full calendar year. Thousands of lives were saved by a floating roadway. The immediate outcome was the fall of the Third Reich. The logistical bridgehead was too strong to break. The impossible obstacle was now a highway to Berlin. Think about the moment the lead engineer finally slept. The storm had passed and the ships were docking. He had successfully defied the experts and the ocean. We must remember the names like White and Steer. the men who used math to defeat a global tyranny. Their weapons were blueprints, concrete, and courage. Wait until you see what happens in our next story. We will look at the bridge that refused to fall down, another tale of tactical innovation against the odds. The specific achievement of 2.5 million tons is key. It's a number that defies the imagination even today. How do you move a mountain over a moving sea? The answer is found in the spirit of the mulberry. It's about looking at a problem from a new angle. It's about the courage to build what others call mad. Modern relevance is found in our offshore technology. Oil rigs and wind farms owe a debt to these pioneers. The sea is no longer a barrier, but a foundation. The tactical innovation of the kite anchor lives on. It's used in deep-sea salvage and maritime rescue, a small detail that saved a global military operation. The psychological toll on the builders was immense. Working 20-hour days 4 months without a break, they knew the fate of the world rested on their welds. The enemy adaptation was too little and too late. They couldn't believe a port could be built in a week. By the time they realized it, the war was already lost. The verification of results came from the high command. Eisenhower called it one of the greatest feats of the war. He knew he couldn't have stayed in France without it. The primary source quotes all tell a similar story, a story of disbelief turning into pure admiration. It was like a miracle rising out of the foam. The mystery element was the simplicity of the design. Simple physics applied to a complex military problem. Using the water to fight the water was the key. The temporal markers show how fast the world changed. From a sketch in 1942 to a city in June of 1944. A timeline of genius under the most extreme pressure. Notice how the patterns of the waves dictate the design. The engineers had to become students of the moon. The tides were the rhythm they had to dance to. The running count of the phoenixes tells the tale. 146 giants sunk in a row, creating a 2-mile wall in the middle of the ocean. Here is what nobody knew about the fuel lines. They were disguised as standard telegraph cables. Even if a diver found them, they looked harmless. The innovation wasn't just in the big structures. It was in the tiny valves and the flexible joints. The small things made the big miracle possible. The forward references in this story are clear. Every modern amphibious assault uses these principles. The impossible is now the standard operating procedure. The historical assessment is unanimous today. The Mulberry Harbor was the secret weapon of D-Day. It didn't explode, but it destroyed the enemy's plans. We summarize the core lesson of this breakthrough. Innovation is the result of necessity and bravery. When there is no path forward, you build your own. The connection to broader military principles is vital. Logistics is the difference between a raid and a war. The engineers are the ones who make the war possible. Imagine the cockpit of a plane looking down today. You wouldn't see the harbor, but you see the result. A free Europe that was supplied by those floating piers. The technical specifications were a work of art. Every bolt and every beam had a specific purpose. There was no room for error and no time for waste. The hero of our story didn't carry a rifle. He carried a slide rule and a vision for the future. He overcame the impossible by simply doing the math. The method used is still a masterclass. In resilience, building for the worst-case scenario saved the mission. The storm was the test, and the whale passed. This is where it gets really interesting for the future. We are now looking at floating cities for rising seas. The Mulberry is the blueprint for the next century. The achievement by the end was total victory. The engineering breakthrough was the silent partner. It's the story of the mind defeating the mountain. The moment the lead engineer finally figured it out, a quiet realization that the tide could be a tool. That moment changed the course of human history. Our summary today is a tribute to that genius, to the men who built a port where none could exist, to the engineers who overwrote the laws of physics. If you want more stories of tactical innovation, hit the subscribe button and join our community. We explore the intersection of grit and genius. Next week, we look at a bridge in the heart of Germany, a structure that stood when everything else fell. You won't want to miss the tactical breakdown. Thank you for watching this deep dive into history. Remember that every obstacle is an opportunity in disguise. We will see you in the next video for more stories. The impossible is only a word until someone builds it. The Mulberry engineers proved that once and for all, the city on the sea remains a testament to human will. Every floating roadway was a lifeline for freedom. The steel under the tanks was made of sheer defiance. They refused to let the ocean stop the liberation. From the first sketch to the final sinking block, the engineers were racing against the shadow of tyranny. Their victory was measured in tons and safe landings. Think of the logistics required to feed an army. Every calorie and every bullet came through this port. The Mulberry Harbor was the lung of the invasion force. As we look back 80 years later, the lesson stands. Bold ideas require even bolder execution to succeed. The engineers of 1944 showed us the way forward. We honor the builders, the divers, and the dreamers. Those who looked at a flat beach and saw a fortress. The men who turned the tide by mastering the waves. Tactical innovation isn't just about better weapons. It's about solving the problems that others ignore. It's about moving the immovable with logic and light. This has been the story of the impossible port, a miracle of engineering that changed our world forever. We are still walking on the foundations they laid. Behind every great general is a great engineer. Without the road, the army cannot find the front. The Mulberry was the road that led to peace. In the face of a storm, we find our true strength. The Mulberry survived when the experts said it couldn't. Resilience is built into the very soul of the design. The legacy of D-Day is often told in bullets. Today, we told the story of the concrete and the steel, the unsung heroes who built the path to victory. Never let an expert tell you it's impossible. Show them the blueprints of the Eremachus harbor. Show them what happens when a mind meets a mission. The waves still hit the shore where the piers stood. The echoes of the hammers can still be heard in history. The city on the sea is gone, but the spirit remains. We study these moments to prepare for our own challenges. Innovation is a muscle that must be trained every day. The Mulberry engineers were the ultimate athletes of logic. From the English coast to the French sand, the Bridge of Freedom was built by hand and heart. A 20-minute journey through a 100-day miracle. Stay curious and keep looking for the impossible. The next great breakthrough is waiting for an engineer. Maybe that engineer is watching this video right now. Join us as we continue to uncover the secrets of war, the tactical, the technical, and the truly human stories. Every week, we dive deeper into the mind of the hero. 2.5 million tons later, the mission is complete. The harbor served its purpose and saved a continent. Fade to black on the greatest engineering feat of man.